and it's my great honor to be able to talk to all of you today. And I want to also express my gratitude and my admiration for the team at Michigan State University in how they've carried forward, even at these complex times, that they've managed to shift very quickly to an entirely virtual event. As Kristen was saying, of course, uh, they've done similar things in the past. They have really set, I think, an incredible example on how to live stream and share talks for previous symposia. But what they've shown today, I think, might also be a way forward for other conferences, and how we can ensure that we can keep talking to each other across different cultures and across different geographies, which I think is more important today than ever as we navigate these complex crises. So again, I find their way of embracing this virtual space inspiring for all of us. And again, thank you very much for having me. So one thing that you'll notice is that I changed the subtitle of my talk slightly to address some of the things that I think are particularly important today. So many of the things that have been on my mind as we enter into these unprecedented situations have I've tried to weave them into my thoughts. So you will see that the subtitle is a bit different. And let me start sharing my screen. So okay, so here we go. Um, I hope that you all can see me. I'm going to okay, so I can see, yeah, Kristen saying that it's all good. So as you see now, this is the subtitle now is digital portals for intercultural exchange. The starting point behind these reflections is that there is no such thing as a culturally neutral interface. Interfaces are the products of histories, of power relations, and of culturally situated perspectives on what matters and how it should be communicated. These are some fairly uncontroversial statements to make to an audience, such as this one, gathered here at the Digital Humanities Symposium. The intersections of culture and interfaces are a rich area of academic reflection. But I believe that a concept is missing in this discussion. And I would like to propose to you the notion of emic interfaces. So for me, an emic interface is a digital space where the user interface and or the user experience principles are derived from a cultural community's internal schemes and internal ways of representing themselves. So I have this website over here that, as Kristen was saying, will be shared later in the website of, uh, of this symposium. And I would really want to know what people think about these ideas and to contribute other examples from other parts of the world, even just by browsing through the program of, of this Global Digital Humanities Symposium. I can already find many examples of things that might be classified as emic interfaces. And I'm here building on this emic etic distinction that is often used in anthropology. So emic theories are derived from a cultural community's inner logic, whereas it, it, these interfaces that I'm proposing are also based on how different epistemic communities make sense of their own traditions. So I want to offer here an overview of what is a much wider practice. And there are, to be sure, many projects I'm not yet familiar with. So I would really want to encourage everybody who's watching now or future listeners through the website to share resources on similar interfaces via the website. And I will later share these via a public website with all of you with proper attribution. I also want to note briefly that even though this concept that I'm proposing as new is perhaps hasn't perhaps been used so far, there are connections to similar concepts, such as Joanna Drucker's humanities data visualizations or the feminist data visualization idea proposed by D'Ignacio and Klein, and of course Claire Warwick's idea of what makes physical interfaces pleasurable and culturally valuable, or Whitelow's notion of generous interface. I also believe that emic interfaces have taken a radical urgency today. Many of us are under some form of lockdown, quarantine, or practicing self-isolation, and we do not yet know how long this will go for. But there is a real possibility that for some time to come, we might be engaging each other primarily through digital interfaces. Many of us are communicating with our students, our relatives, and our friends primarily through interfaces. Other conferences might shift online, semester abroad programs might be postponed, and one of the real losses is the types of friendships and connections that emerge from conversations in the corridors, from drinks after an event in a conference or a class, or from the serendipitous encounters with artifacts, with daily rituals that shows we are in a different part of the world. So that's something that we're losing now through by shifting online. For me, this is a great joy of travel, this encounter with unsuspected reminders of the cultural complexity of the world in the ways that are social, effective, and immediate. So if we shift online, we stand to lose this. But if we develop Emic interfaces, we have perhaps a role to play, and these interfaces might guarantee that we continue to interact with different cultural viewpoints. So that's the background of what I want to talk about today. In place of a table of contents, I want to offer this image to you today. In this talk, I want to draw a shape that goes from work done by me to work done by others. It starts off as a series of concrete examples, but then becomes increasingly abstract and moves increasingly towards things that I don't yet know and to open questions that I want to share with you. So first, I will describe some of my own projects and tell you a little bit about Java, Indonesia, and the cultural traditions that I study. But then I will briefly describe work done by other people, and then throw in a couple of ideas for projects that have yet to be carried out. Perhaps some of you might want to collaborate with me on these projects. To conclude, I will try to link my thoughts to other theories and invite you to join me in considering many other open questions. So let me take you for a moment to the part of the world where I live. And what you see in this image is Wayang Kulit. This is a form of puppetry that has been practiced in Java for at least 1,000 years, and which is still actively performed today. So I will describe different projects around Wayang Kulit in the first few minutes of my talk. Some of them are very simple, and others are more involved. So I will start by describing really basic interventions on how we can use WhatsApp during a live performance, but please bear with me and I will move on to increasingly complex projects. So just a bit more on Wayang Kulit. I have spent over a decade studying this form, and one of the things that's kept me interested in this, one of the things that fascinates me, is the complexity of the conventions that shape the music, the puppet usage, and the stories. Wayang Kulit is the most respected art form in Java, and just to give you an idea, a performance goes on for about 8 hours. So it would start around 9:30 p.m. and would go maybe until 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. And this is attended by all kinds of people, old, young, people who chance upon a performance, and people who are fans of a specific artist. So this one that you see over here is a typical image, or this one here, you can appreciate the dalang, the puppeteer, or perhaps better described as the puppet master, who controls the music, who speaks all the character parts, and who also strings the story together. So sometimes people would see the shadow. So in theory, you could go behind the screen, but most people want to see what's happening here. So they want to see the puppeteer controlling the puppet and also the shadow that it casts. So typically in a book, you would see these kinds of images, but this is also an incredibly social event. So here it's a bit hard to appreciate, but you can, it's hard to capture in the same frame because of the difference in the contrast, but the performance is happening over here. So way over here, you see the puppeteer, and then you see the musicians around here, and sometimes a few thousand people gathered to see a performance. This, of course, has been also canceled in Indonesia, as the ongoing COVID situation has also impacted the performing arts around the world. But this is what it looked like in the recent past. These are incredibly social events. In past years, I always brought my students from Singapore to Indonesia to watch Wayang and also to learn from local artists and to interact with local students. So this is a complex tradition. And the problem that I face is how to communicate the complexities and nuance of the form and the language. So I have been inspired by the work of other people, in particular by the work of uh, Catherine Emerson, who is a scholar who's dedicated more than 30 years of her life to learning the conventions and language of Wayang. And she's, by the way, originally from Michigan, but now has made Java her home. And for several years, what she has done is live translations, which are projected next to the performances and provide foreigners that are not familiar with the form with a window into this complex tradition. So these are incredible feats that I hope to emulate one day. But inspired by her, I've tried to do something simpler where I use WhatsApp to do a live translation. So here, the advantage of this simple system is that people can watch the performances and then refer back to the transcript. And then it's entirely conventional for these performances to take a nap, to talk to your neighbors, to eat something. So then you can wander off for a while, nap off if you want, and then you can come back to this WhatsApp chat group and see what's the last message that you saw. And then I can also use this in my own classes. Here you can see, if you look at the time code, that some of these interactions are happening at 3 a.m. in the morning. So, okay, I was just getting a message that my connection is a little bit unstable, but I hope that I can continue. So of course, this is a ready-made solution, and it really doesn't go that far. It's a far cry from what I call Emic interfaces. But I would like to stress that sometimes these ready available solutions can be used to achieve intercultural understanding. And sometimes we need to design other projects from scratch. So in choosing the solutions, there are always complex trade-offs in terms of costs, data privacy, effort, and convenience. And I will return to these points towards the end of the talk. But let me now move on to a different, more complex project. While the previous solution is ready-made, and I quickly adapted it to my own teaching solution, this other project was 30 years in the making, and I only joined at the very last moment. So Professor Bernard Arps from Leiden University wrote a book where he translated a Wayang Kulit show from Javanese into English. There are many such books, but this is really one of the masterpieces in the translations of the form. And this is the product of research carried throughout many, many years. The translation is accompanied by notes, which he terms historization clues, references to performances and conventions in the past, and contextualization clues that refer to how people in the Javanese context might understand certain conventions. So the transcription uses Tetlock's concept of ethnopoetics, and this is accompanied by interpretive descriptions. For this, Professor Arbs developed his own typographic system to show things such as the presence of music, the duration of pauses, the usage of conventions, such as the ways in which the puppeteer calls for the musics, for the musicians to begin and end the accompaniment. So here you can see some of those visual cues, and I'm not going to demonstrate this website live, but you can find this here if you go to my website or just from here. So what I've basically done is after the book was published, I wrote to him and I asked if he could be interested in working with me, developing his book into an interactive project. So we created this website, and what you have here is essentially a facsimile of the book. So for example, this box that you see over here means that there's music in the background. And this over here means that there is a note, an interactive note that you can click on. And you have the original in Javanese and the translation into English. So if you go to this website, you can also see that it's linked to a video recording. You can jump back and forth throughout the video, throughout the text. You can use the text as a way to orient yourself throughout the performance. And again, this is an 8-hour performance. So it's all freely available as a test version in this website that, again, I'm not going to demonstrate it live now since I don't want to jam the connection, but I would really encourage people to go and try this out. And also one thing that I'm currently working on is a Python open source package to develop similar types of multimedia editions. So here I converted his book into this system, into this website that attends to the specific problems of Wayang Kulit, that it's all developed around the conventions of the music and the stories of Wayang. But my interest is how people who work with audiovisual material from elsewhere in the world can create their own multimedia editions. So I don't want to make a one-size-fits-all solution, but enable people to use different existing annotation software and connect that to existing output formats that are compatible with different online publication platforms. So to build a sort of bridge between existing software annotation and existing publication platforms. So the idea is to develop a flexible approach that can be adapted to the analysis and annotation of many different cultural traditions according to the inner conventions of their communities of practice. So this is useful for scholarly analysis, it's useful for teaching, but there are still certain things that a project like this misses, and that is the embodied and tangible aspects of a tradition such as Wayang Kulit. So we can take the quest for Emic interfaces one step further and develop tangible user interfaces that use actual objects imbued with cultural significance and that derive gestural metaphors from the tradition itself. So here you can see an example of a tangible user interface that we, together with one of my students, I developed as an arts project. So this was presented in Indonesia and then in Singapore. And again, you can see the video here. There's a YouTube video that, again, I will not show live, but I would encourage people to go and check it out. But I will just try to explain briefly what happens. And I'm actually going to stop sharing the screen for a moment. And actually, I have this puppet here with me. So this is called a Kayon, and I wanted to hold one, give you a sense of the size of the. Now let me to my. Okay, so this is replicated from, and all of this is connected and are doing. What we wanted to do is to use some of the control. For example, when you have these, often using has begun, and then so this interface is that you can actually lift the Kayon. You can see that in, and then rotate it. Also, the puppet here to cue the musicians. We wanted to use that to navigate also through the videos by different information. So basically, in this art piece, I'm the puppeteer, and you control videos in a collection where you learn more about Wayang Kulit, screen and a normal computer. But this is your system that is built with the objects and the gestural conventions that come directly from Java. So you will also see in the video that when we presented this in Indonesia, people were both fascinated and a little bit frustrated also by the way in which it mimics, but it's not yet perfect. There are some gaps, and that opens spaces for conversation. Many of the people that you see in the video are also my own teachers in the art of Wayang Kulit that are using this digital interface. So far, I've been talking about projects that aim at communicating culturally specific understandings. And these are based on philological and ethnographic work. But what about the types of quantitative projects that many people in digital humanities are creating? What is the applicability of Emic interfaces to quantitative work? So let me take a little detour to address this and talk about culturally specific visualizations. Slightly more experimental parts of the talk, and I hope you will bear with me for a moment as I explain some of the concepts behind this. So I was interested in developing this thing called the Kayon plot. One of my projects is also the quantitative analysis of Wayang Kulit videos. And the videos that you see in the tangible user interface and that I used for this data visualization are also freely available from the Contemporary Wayang archive that you can access here. So these are, fully freely available shorter performances. So these are not the traditional 8-hour performances, but these are shorter performances that combine the conventions of Wayang with popular music such as hip hop. So Again, this is freely available. So if people are probably spending now a lot of time at home and they cannot really go to see theater performances, so this is perhaps something that you might want to watch later. So going back to this research project. So I was working with my collaborator, Gea Oswafata Parikasir, who's a professor of engineering physics at Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia. And we wanted to do a quantitative close reading of these videos. So let me explain very briefly what we did. We used a technique called the image difference. So basically, the image difference is based on the idea that when you take a video apart, it's a sequence of still images. So you can take this video, this still image, and the very next one. So hopefully you can see this even throughout the possible lag in Zoom. Otherwise, you can find my slides for download, and you can see there's a very slight change in the hand of the puppet. So this is from one frame to the next. So what we do is we subtract one image from the previous one, and we get this image difference. So you can see here uh, uh, a few pixels. So actually, one advantage of presenting this over Zoom is that now people can see this image that if I were in a larger room, it will be very hard for people to appreciate. So here you can see a certain number of pixels that change from one image to the next. So then what we did was we graphed that as a function of time. So here you can see how many non-identical pixels are at every point of the video. So this is slightly over an hour. And then we were interested in showing these, how different scenes, so we manually segmented these into scenes and show how these scenes are different. And here we use a conventional approach where we show the average and standard deviation for each of these scenes. But years later, after we published this paper that you can find here in the link, I was wondering whether we could find alternative ways to create a data visualization of the changes of the speed of the video. So basically what this tells you is that it's a proxy for how much movement there is through different scenes in the video. So then I was experimenting with Violin plots that might be familiar to people in this community. Otherwise, there are some links over here. So basically, the Violin plot shows you also the median. Usually, it shows you the spread of the data, the minimum, the maximum, the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile, and also it has a rotated kernel density estimation, which looks a little bit like what you would see in a histogram, in a rotated histogram. So it conveys a lot of interesting statistical information about the data you're trying to visualize. So I was playing with that, and I wanted to make these violin plots for my different scenes in my Wayang Kulit video. But I also wanted to indicate the types of the classification of different kinds of scenes, and also show the length of each scene. So here I have a bar chart below that shows you how long each scene is. And while I was doing this, I realized that this looks a little bit like the Kayon. So the same puppet that I showed you a moment ago, the same one that we used for this tangible user interface. And this, by the way, has a lot of really important dramatic and symbolic functions. So then what I did was shift a little bit the axis here in this visualization. So you get to see something that looks a little bit like a Kayon, but also conveys information. So here, the length of what this, here this would be actually a piece of bone that is used to insert the puppet into the banana trunk. And that shows you the length of the scene. Here, this space in the middle shows you the median. And here, the shape of this tells you the distribution of the values. So for example, you get to see certain scenes that tend to be very slow, but also the values tend to be concentrated towards a lower number of non-identical pixels, and others that are really spread all the way to the top, like this one over here or this one. And they are both narrative scenes. So you can start to see a comparison, and you can do this quantitative analysis through this visualization. Now, the reason why I'm excited about this is because this, I believe, is a culturally specific data visualization that also includes statistical information, such as the mean, the distribution. So it's not an infographic or what the Tufts calls in a less generous way a chart junk. It has a high data ink ratio. It doesn't have ornaments. So it's something that I believe is still sound from a statistical point of view, but still conveys a culturally specific meaning. So my question moving forward is, can we create other forms of data visualization that are both statistically sound, but culturally specific? So I don't believe we need to choose between these two things, that we can move forward with quantitative projects that are still premised on a culturally specific way of understanding the world. So now let me move on to a different section of this talk. So I'm done now with this short overview of different projects in Java all around Wayang Kulit. And now I want to say something about other kinds of approaches, other kinds of projects that people might be uh, interested in doing. So I was originally planning on showing this project, who is by this project is by Sean Pugh, who's also at Michigan State University. But I noticed in the program that he's actually going to be speaking about this tomorrow. So I will not upstage him, but rather encourage the participants to go and look at this incredible project, where you can also see different ways of visualizing poetic meter in South Asian languages. So when you go to the website, you can see that you can listen to poems, but also understand the conventions around poetic meter. So I think he has found a really convincing visual way of explaining the different kinds of conventions, the different kinds of possibilities for the poetic meter. And this is something that you can get from this image, from this interactive interface. But also, I think there's a visceral experience of beauty, that we can listen to the poetry, but also it sensitizes us to a different way of thinking about poetic conventions. And I think that's another important goal for Emic interfaces. So there are other things that I want to talk about now, and these are not necessarily projects that have been done by others, but maybe projects that could be done by others, hopefully in collaboration, maybe by people here at this conference that want to work with each other or with me in thinking about some of these ideas. So I've been thinking about this article here that was originally published in BuzzFeed News. So it says, the man who built a retweet, we handed a loaded weapon to 4-year-olds. And he's talking about Alex Kantrowitz, who created the retweet button, who was responsible for the implementation, that perhaps there are better ways to encourage different types of interactions. So for example, he was thinking, looking back into in time, whether he could have added a constraint so that before you retweet a story, you need to have opened the link, or perhaps you have to have read the story. So there are things that we can do in our interfaces. Sometimes they're as simple as adding a button that perhaps can foster some kind of intercultural competence. And I have a couple of ideas around this that I want to explore. So one of my favorite ideas, one thing that I think is desperately needed also in the current context, is to have hackable online chat rooms. I'm speaking to you through Zoom now, and I've also been teaching through Zoom. And I think in many ways it's a great piece of software, except that it's not customizable. So what if we could do something that is like Zoom, but where we have our own buttons, something that you can actually customize? You can create your own interface. Now, of course, Zoom comes pre-built with certain buttons that signal interactions, such as raising your hand, asking the presenter to go faster or slower. But what if we could include other kinds of constraints to generate games, perhaps, or to generate serious types of interactions that help us think about intercultural differences? With my students, when I teach classes on intercultural difference, we do a lot of course dynamics uh, live in a physical classroom, and I'm interested in whether we could reproduce that through a platform such as this. And of course, there are always workarounds, but I think it would be particularly interesting if we could actually build our own interfaces and customize them in a way that we can design for a different kind of interaction. So I'm also interested in this idea of shifting perspectives. And here I want to share again, this is from the New York Times archive. And so uh, maybe some of you know this 2016 interactive visualization. So what they did was that they had the same graph, and then you could click different portions of the interface, and it would show you how people from different political persuasions would look at the same data. So I really don't have the right expertise to talk about this specific context, the context of U.S. politics, and I don't really want to say something about the uh, how successful they are in their intended aim, but the idea that you can click a button and show you a different perspective, that it would reorganize the contents of your interface according to a different perspective, is something that I find truly inspiring. And I'm wondering whether we can do that in websites that show translation, in websites that foster interaction, that you could click a button and see everything from a different perspective. And especially if this is something that could be user generated. If we could ask our students to also hack into these systems and rearrange the contents of a Zoom equivalent class according to different constraints. Thinking about this, I'm also inspired by the work of Carola Lorea, who's a colleague of mine here at the National University of Singapore. And she's been doing a lot of work on vowel songs. So vowels, as you might know, are mystic minstrels that work and perform in Bangladesh and in West Bengal. And they have taken some notoriety overseas. There are some really famous vowel performers. There are that travel throughout international venues, or that also often perform in upper class settings throughout India. But a lot of the conventions of their music and of their mystic traditions are little known. And so talking to Carola, she was telling me, for example, how vowel songs cannot be interrupted once they start. So I was thinking, could we design interfaces that respect this kind of cultural etiquette, this kind of cultural prohibition? So for example, if a singer is interpreting a song live, they need to sing the song in full. And here, when you look at the UNESCO page, you can see that people can, you can play and stop. But what if we did a website that at least indicates that there is a certain social convention around the enjoyment of these songs? Or for example, she was also saying that the type of interpretation of a song depends on a listener's level of initiation. So there should be at least 4 translations per song. So perhaps you could also create an interface that shifts between these different aspects. You can perhaps also transgress this if you like as a user, but at least indicate that the level of translation is not the same for every potential listener, every potential user. So now I arrive at the last part of this talk, and I want to talk a little bit about potential theories that could connect Emic interfaces to other discourse in the digital humanities, and also share with you a variety of open questions. So as I move towards this conclusion, uh, one important thing that I want to reiterate is that I'm offering you a very uh, quick overview of what I'm sure is a much wider phenomenon. And I'm sure that many of you are creating Emic interfaces, and I'd love to know also if you find the concept interesting and useful, and also that I would want to be able to share other kinds of work done in other parts of the world. So if you can answer these, if you can go to the link to the Google form from this website, uh, I would greatly appreciate that. So as I conclude this talk, let me offer an incipient taxonomy of Emic interfaces. So we can think of different projects along 2 dimensions, at least 2 dimensions. There are perhaps many other taxonomies. So here, I've imagined these two dimensions. So we have user experience and user interface. So when it comes to Emic user experience, that would be when every aspect of an interface is geared towards cross-cultural understanding, towards the awareness of culturally specific ideas. And then on the other side, we would see etic user experience. Likewise, we can think of Emic user interface, where the interface itself derives visual metaphors, tropes, interaction gestures from a cultural community. But we can also think more broadly about projects that are aimed at communicating a cultural community's own frame of reference, even when using etic interface connections. So, for example, here I would place certain projects such as the Visualizing Poetic Meter, the WhatsApp translation, the Multimedia interface. And over here, I would place most of the other projects, the prohibitions project, the tangible Wayang screen, the Kayon plot. So the reason why I want to share this taxonomy is because I believe that the UX goal of fostering cross-cultural understanding is more important than just preserving visual tropes. So everything that is above here is more important. So whether we use etic user interface, whether we borrow buttons and conventions from somewhere else is not as important as the fact that the experience itself, the user journey that we want to take the users of an interface through is geared towards this cross-cultural understanding. Because one danger that I see is that if we're here on this quadrant of etic UI and etic UX, we can do things that are parodies or perhaps oversimplifications. So if we were just to use buttons and icons taken from a cultural community, but without seeking a user experience of cross-cultural awareness, we could also easily end up creating parodies. And I think there's great risk in this. And for this reason, we should constantly critique our own work, our own attempts at creating Emic interfaces, and recognize that it's really hard to design interfaces that actually foster intercultural awareness. In thinking about the complexity of this task, I find comfort in the work of Dwight Conkerwood, who was an inspiring performance scholar and anthropologist. He mostly worked with refugee Hmong communities in the US. And if you're a performance scholar, you might be familiar with his work. In this diagram that I often show in my classes, he shows that when we aim to represent someone else's cultural material, it is very easy to find oneself in one of four extreme positions: the enthusiast infatuation, the custodian's ripoff, the skeptic's cop-out, or the curator's exhibitionism. In fact, he says that it's almost impossible as we begin a journey towards the study of another culture, not to accidentally display, for example, the enthusiast's infatuation. Without this passionate but superficial fascination for another culture, perhaps no one would have the energy to embark in the decades-long study of another culture. But we should strive, Conkerwood says, for a dialogical performance, this space of genuine conversation. But this is a shifting position. It's not a place that stands still once you reach it. And to remain engaged in dialogical performances, one needs to constantly update one's position and to keep one's ears open. So I try to do this in my own work by showing these projects in Indonesia, and by also working with cultural experts from Java who have a far greater understanding of these traditions than I do. But I believe that the quest for dialogical performance, as the quest for Emic interfaces, is a never-ending process. So for this reason, as I bring my thoughts to a close, I want to emphasize the importance of developing our own interfaces. We need to move towards future-proof open source solutions. As much as I love the interfaces that we are using now, I think that we need to consider and counter the politics and the financial models of commercial platforms. And being able to make our own interfaces becomes increasingly important. So there's scope here, I hope, for open source scalable solutions. Minimal computing has perhaps a role to play. And here's the minimal computing website that I think is incredibly relevant for this today, or the Humanities Commons Learning Space, where they've put together a range of projects that for people who are, for example, teaching now. And I think that this is the way to start thinking about these future-proof open solutions. So I want to thank you all for listening to these ideas, and I look forward to your questions and your ideas on how to expand and apply these concepts and how to design better interfaces collectively and to learn more from one another's work and to learn more about the intellectual and artistic traditions that we study, the traditions that fascinate us. But I am, of course, sad that I cannot meet you in person. I am worried about the ongoing crisis that is changing our world. But part of me is also sad for selfish reasons. I'm sad that I cannot travel, that I cannot see you in person, that I cannot have a beer or a coffee with you. Because you see, I love traveling. And I think that's true for most of us gathered here today. I have been very fortunate to have spent long periods of time in many different countries, learning other languages, learning to appreciate other ways of looking at the world. I think that's by far the most transformative experience I've ever had. And we might not be able to travel again like this for a while, hopefully not for very long. But perhaps we might encounter other forms of crisis in the future. Or more optimistically, perhaps we might voluntarily embrace virtual conferences in order to limit our carbon footprint or to involve more people in our global conversations, as MSU has done with this symposium in the past. So could Emic interfaces provide us with the beauty and the wisdom of culture shock? Could we find ways to encounter one another through platforms that can tell us something about each other? When people came to Singapore in the past, I always like to bring them to my house to have dinner with my family. But perhaps there's a way to bring people to our interfaces that is just beyond sharing images, but also sharing metaphors for interaction that are based on cultural principles, on culturally situated ways of thinking about the world, of structuring the world. So can we design emic interfaces for intercultural exchange? With this hopeful but open-ended question, I end my talk. Thank you very much.